May 27, 1931, somewhere on the Minnesota prairie just east of Moorhead, an engineer B.E. McKee is staring through the cab window of a 136-ton locomotive at something that should not exist. The sky has turned black, then blacker, and now there is this sickly greenish-yellow light spreading across the horizon like a bruise that keeps getting worse with every passing second. McKee has been running trains on the Great Northern Railway for years, and he knows exactly what that color means. He has heard the old-timers talk about it in the roundhouse, that particular shade of yellow-green that only appears when the atmosphere is doing something terrible to itself, when the pressure is dropping so fast that the air itself starts behaving in ways that no engineer wants to see from the cab of a passenger train, carrying over 100 souls across open prairie with nowhere to hide. Behind him, stretched out along the right-of-way like a green and gold snake, sit 11 Pullman cars filled with 117 passengers who have absolutely no idea what their engineer is looking at right now. Most of them are reading newspapers, playing cards, dozing in their seats after a good lunch in the dining car, or watching the Minnesota landscape roll past their windows without really seeing it. They left Fargo Station about 20 minutes ago, right on schedule, and they are expecting to reach St. Paul by evening and Chicago sometime tomorrow. They have paid good money for tickets on the Empire Builder, the finest passenger train the Great Northern Railway operates, and they trust that the men running this locomotive know exactly what they are doing. They have no idea that in the next few seconds, the man at the throttle is going to make a decision that violates everything the Great Northern Operating Manual tells him to do in a situation like this. They have no idea that B.E. McKee is about to bet their lives on raw horsepower and split-second timing, gambling that a steam locomotive running flat out can somehow outrace a force of nature that is spinning its way across the prairie at speeds no train has ever matched. The Empire Builder, in 1931, was the absolute pride of the Great Northern Railway, an transcontinental luxury service that connected Seattle to Chicago through some of the most spectacular mountain scenery in North America. The train had been inaugurated just 2 years earlier, in June of 1929, and it was named after James J. Hill himself, the legendary railroad baron who had built the Great Northern from nothing into one of the most successful privately financed railroads in American history. Hill had earned the nickname the Empire Builder for his role in opening up the Pacific Northwest to settlement and commerce, and the Great Northern had decided that their flagship passenger train deserved to carry that name into the new decade. 6 complete train sets rotated through the Empire Builder schedule, each one consisting of heavyweight Pullman equipment finished in the distinctive dark green paint that the company used for all its premier passenger services. The consists typically included a railway post office car for mail, a baggage car, several coaches for passengers traveling on standard tickets, a dining car where white-jacketed waiters served meals on real china with actual silverware, multiple sleeping cars with private compartments and drawing rooms for first-class passengers, and at the very rear, an observation lounge car where travelers could sit in comfortable chairs and watch the landscape disappear behind them through enormous windows. The observation car on the Empire Builder featured an enclosed solarium instead of the traditional open platform, a design choice that made perfect sense given the brutal winters that could hit the northern Great Plains without warning. The locomotive pulling train number 2 that afternoon was most likely an S2 Class Northern, one of 14 massive 484 steam engines that Baldwin Locomotive Works had delivered to the Great Northern between March and April of 1930. These locomotives had been designed specifically for Empire Builder service, built to replace the older P2 class mountains that could no longer keep up with the demanding schedule the railroad wanted to maintain. The S2 was a genuine beast of an engine, weighing over 400,000 pounds with its tender fully loaded, yet capable of hauling 18 heavyweight Pullman cars at 80 miles per hour across the flat tangent track of the Montana and Minnesota divisions without breaking a sweat. The engineering that went into these locomotives represented the absolute cutting edge of American steam technology in 1930. Baldwin had fitted them with 80-inch driving wheels, the largest ever installed on a Great Northern passenger locomotive, specifically to enable the high sustained speeds that transcontinental service demanded. The boiler was a radial stay design, rather than the bell pair type that Great Northern usually preferred, a choice made to reduce weight without sacrificing steam-generating capacity. The tender carried 17,000 gallons of water and 5,800 gallons of fuel oil, enough to run several hundred miles between service stops on divisions where water towers and fueling stations might be spaced far apart. McKee was running around 50 miles per hour when he first noticed the sky starting to change in ways that made his stomach tighten. Heavy rain had begun falling about 10 minutes out of Fargo, which was nothing unusual for late May in Clay County, where spring thunderstorms could roll through at almost any time without warning. The passengers had probably noticed the rain drumming against the windows and thought nothing of it, just another prairie storm that would blow over in an hour or two. But McKee was watching the clouds through the cab window, and he was seeing something that ordinary passengers would not recognize. A particular kind of turbulence in the storm system that suggested the atmosphere was becoming dangerously unstable. The wind picked up suddenly, gusting hard enough to push against the side of the locomotive in a way that McKee could feel through the controls. Then the clouds started doing something that no experienced railroad man ever wants to see, bulging downward toward the earth in dark rotating masses that looked almost alive, like something enormous was trying to reach down from the sky and touch the ground. A farmer named Fleming was watching from his property about a quarter-mile south of the railroad tracks when he saw a small funnel appear to the southwest, bobbing up and down near the surface of the prairie, like it could not quite decide whether to fully form into a tornado or dissipate back into the storm clouds above. Then, the top of a nearby haystack exploded into the air, scattering straw across the landscape like confetti, and the funnel stopped bouncing around. It was on the ground now, fully formed, spinning at speeds that would later be estimated between 136 and 165 miles per hour, an F3 tornado that was cutting across Clay County on a path that would take it directly across the Great Northern Main Line somewhere in the next few minutes. That was the moment when B.E. McKee had to make his choice. Standard procedure in 1931 for a passenger train encountering severe weather was absolutely clear and left no room for interpretation. You reduce speed immediately. You stop the train entirely if visibility dropped below safe operating limits. You waited for conditions to improve before proceeding, even if that meant arriving at your destination hours behind schedule. The railroad rulebook had been written by men who understood that schedules meant nothing compared to the lives of passengers, and every engineer on the Great Northern knew that caution came first, timetables came second, and the safety of the people riding behind you came above everything else in every situation without exception. But McKee was watching that funnel grow larger by the second, tracking its movement across the prairie, calculating angles and speeds in his head with the kind of instinctive mathematics that experienced engineers develop after years of running trains through every kind of weather the Great Plains can produce. And he understood something that the operating manual had never anticipated. Something that the men who wrote the rulebook had probably never considered, because it seemed so unlikely that any passenger train would ever find itself in exactly this situation. Stopping meant sitting still on an exposed stretch of prairie with absolutely nowhere to hide and no protection except the thin steel walls of the passenger cars. There were no cuts or embankments along this section of track, no bridges or tunnels where the train could shelter, nothing but flat open farmland stretching away in every direction. If McKee stopped the Empire Builder right here and told everyone to get out and lie in a ditch, there was no ditch to lie in. The passengers would be exposed on open ground with a tornado bearing down on them at speeds no human being could outrun on foot. And if he kept the train stopped on the tracks, the tornado would simply run right over them. Those 70-ton Pullman cars looked solid and heavy from the outside, but McKee knew that a tornado like the one he was watching could pick up an automobile and throw it a quarter mile. It could demolish a brick farmhouse in seconds. It could do things to a passenger train that no railroad engineer wanted to think about too carefully, especially when that train was carrying 117 people who were trusting him to get them safely to Chicago. The mathematics were brutal and terrifyingly simple. If he stopped, the tornado would catch them, and there would be nothing he could do about it. If he ran, if he pushed the S2 to everything she had and tried to outrace that funnel across the prairie, He might be able to get far enough ahead that the twister would pass behind the last observation car instead of slamming broadside into the middle of his consist. It was a desperate gamble, the kind of calculation that no operating manual could ever sanction, because it involved betting over 100 lives on split-second timing and the raw horsepower of a steam locomotive. McKee jerked the throttle wide open. The S2 responded immediately, all that Baldwin engineering surging to life as the drivers bit hard into the rail, and the entire train began accelerating forward with a force that passengers in the rear cars could probably feel pushing them back into their seats. The locomotive was designed for exactly this kind of performance, built to accelerate heavy passenger consists quickly when the schedule demanded it. And McKee was demanding everything the engine had to give. 60 miles per hour on this stretch of track was pushing the limits of what the Great Northern considered safe operating speed, but McKee was not thinking about speed limits or operating procedures anymore. He was thinking about that funnel and the angle it was traveling and the number of seconds he needed to buy if he was going to get his passengers clear of its path. Behind him, in the Pullman cars, passengers felt the train surge forward and probably assumed their engineer was simply trying to make up time lost to the weather delay. Some of them might have looked out the windows and seen the sky turning that ugly greenish-yellow color, might have felt a twinge of unease at the darkness gathering on the western horizon. All but none of them could have known what was really happening in the locomotive cab. None of them could have known that their lives now depended on whether a steam engine running flat out could cover enough ground in the next 30 seconds to clear the path of a storm that was crossing the landscape at unpredictable angles. McKee almost made it. The tornado struck the Empire Builder broadside just behind the tender, hitting the baggage car at almost exactly the point where the locomotive and the rest of the train were coupled together. The impact was so sudden and so violent that the coupling snapped clean through like it was made of thread instead of hardened steel designed to hold together under tens of thousands of pounds of pulling force. What happened in the next 15 seconds would become one of the most remarkable events in American railroad history, a collision between a passenger train and a force of nature that witnesses described in slow motion because their minds could not process what they were seeing at normal speed. The vacuum created by the tornado's rotation sucked coach after coach up from the track, lifting 70-ton steel Pullman cars into the air like a giant reaching down from the sky to pick up toys and throw them aside. Farmer Fleming, watching from his property a quarter-mile away, saw the train literally rise off the rails, settle back down for a moment as if the tornado was trying to decide what to do with it, and then rise again before the cars began tumbling through the air in different directions. One Pullman was carried completely off the ground and dropped 80 feet from the right-of-way, landing on its side in a Minnesota wheat field with its windows shattered and passengers tumbling helplessly against walls that had suddenly become floors. 5 more cars followed it, rolling and spinning through the air before crashing down onto the prairie in a cloud of dust and debris so thick that Fleming said he completely lost sight of the entire train. The noise was like nothing anyone present had ever heard before, a combination of shrieking wind, tearing metal, shattering glass, and the deep groaning sound of steel being twisted beyond its design limits. Passengers who survived the wreck would later describe the sensation of being picked up and thrown around inside the cars like dice in a cup. Unable to grab onto anything solid as the entire world rotated around them, some of them blacked out from the impact. Others remained conscious through the entire experience, feeling the car they were riding in lift off the tracks, fly through the air, and slam back down onto the prairie with enough force to buckle the steel frame. And then, out of that massive cloud of dust and debris, came the locomotive. The S2 was still on the rails, still moving forward under its own power, dragging the 94-ton tender behind it as if absolutely nothing had happened. The tornado had passed directly over the coupling between the tender and the baggage car, close enough to rip the train apart, but the locomotive itself had been too heavy and too stable for even an F3 to lift off the track. McKee was completely uninjured in his cab, yet still gripping the throttle, watching in his mirrors as the dust cloud began to settle, and the full extent of the wreckage behind him became visible for the first time. The physics of what had happened would become a subject of considerable discussion among railroad engineers in the years that followed. The locomotive and tender together weighed over 230 tons, with a center of gravity that sat extremely low compared to the passenger cars behind them. When the tornado tried to lift the locomotive the same way it had lifted the Pullmans, it could not get underneath the frame to flip it over. The same design features that made the S2 such a stable platform for high-speed passenger service, the low-slung boiler and the wide wheelbase and the massive weight distributed across 8 driving wheels. Had also made it the one piece of equipment on the entire train that could survive a direct encounter with a prairie tornado. The passenger cars had been different. They were tall and relatively light for their size, with a center of gravity that sat much higher off the rails. When the tornado's vacuum effect pulled upward on those cars, there was nothing to keep them anchored to the track. 70 tons sounds like an enormous amount of weight, but a tornado generating winds of 150 miles per hour can create lifting forces that exceed anything railroad engineers in 1931 had ever designed against. Nobody had ever imagined that a passenger train might need to be built to withstand being picked up by the sky. The rescue operation began almost immediately after the tornado passed. Farmer Fleming was one of the first people to reach the wreckage, picking his way across his own fields toward the overturned Pullman cars that had come crashing down on his property. Other farmers and residents from the nearby town of Sabin began arriving within minutes, their automobiles crowding the rural roads that ran parallel to the railroad tracks. The scene they found was unlike anything most of them had ever witnessed, a string of luxury passenger cars scattered across the prairie like discarded toys, some of them lying on their sides, others upside down, all of them showing the unmistakable damage of having been thrown through the air by a force that no structure made by human hands could have withstood. Inside the wrecked cars, passengers were beginning to pull themselves together and assess their injuries. The majority of them had survived the experience, bruised and bloodied and deeply shaken but alive. Some had broken bones from being thrown against the interior walls and furnishings. Others had cuts from shattered glass that had exploded inward when the windows gave way. A few were unconscious and needed to be carried out of the wreckage by rescuers who had to break through jammed doors and twisted metal to reach them. The Great Northern Railway dispatched a relief train from Fargo as soon as word of the derailment reached railroad officials, and it arrived at the scene within a couple of hours. The relief train transported all 117 passengers back to Fargo for medical evaluation, a journey that must have been surreal for people who had just experienced one of the most violent events imaginable aboard a moving train. 57 of the passengers had injuries serious enough to require medical attention at St. Ansgar Hospital in Moorhead. 3 of them were in serious condition, including a woman named Mrs. Troll from Minot, who was initially not expected to survive, but eventually recovered. 1 passenger did not survive the wreck. Andrew Anderson from Montesano, Washington, was the only fatality among the 117 people riding the Empire Builder that afternoon. 9 crew members were also injured in the derailment, though none of their injuries proved fatal. Given the violence of what had happened, given that an entire passenger train had been literally picked up and thrown across the landscape by a tornado, the fact that only 1 person lost their life was considered something close to miraculous by everyone who witnessed the aftermath. McKee's decision to accelerate into the storm became the subject of considerable debate in the days and weeks that followed. Some railroad officials and safety experts argued that he should have stopped the train immediately when he saw the tornado forming, ordered all passengers to evacuate, and told everyone to lie flat in whatever depression in the ground they could find. This was standard tornado safety advice in 1931, the same guidance that was given to farmers and townspeople across the Great Plains every spring when tornado season arrived. Others pointed out that there was no depression in the ground anywhere near that particular stretch of track, or no ditch or gully where passengers could have taken shelter. If McKee had stopped the train and ordered an evacuation, 117 people would have been standing in an open field when an F3 tornado passed directly over them. The passenger cars, for all the damage they sustained, had at least provided some protection from flying debris in the worst of the tornado's winds. Being inside a steel Pullman car that was being thrown through the air was terrifying and dangerous, but it might well have been safer than standing exposed on open prairie with nothing between you and 150-mile-per-hour wind. The Great Northern Railway never publicly criticized McKee for the choice he made. The company's official position seemed to be that the engineer had done everything humanly possible to save his passengers, and that the outcome, while tragic for Andrew Anderson and his family, could have been immeasurably worse if McKee had made different decisions in those critical seconds when the tornado was bearing down on his train. The railroad treated the incident as a freak occurrence rather than any kind of systemic failure, which was probably the correct assessment given the circumstances. There was nothing wrong with the locomotive, nothing wrong with the track, nothing wrong with the operating procedures that governed how trains were supposed to be run on the Great Northern Main Line. Sometimes the weather simply wins, and the only question anyone can ask afterward is how many people ended up paying the price. The tornado that hit the Empire Builder was later determined to have formed from 3 separate funnel clouds that merged together somewhere over Clay County. The combined storm traveled over 50 miles across the Minnesota prairie before finally weakening near the town of Fertile, leaving a trail of destruction that included 24 farms with damaged or destroyed buildings. An 18-year-old named Melvin Hatledall was struck by debris in the basement of his family's farmhouse about 8 miles north of the railroad tracks and did not survive. The same storm system that caught McKee's train had been cutting across the landscape in multiple directions, making it essentially impossible for anyone to predict exactly where any individual funnel would go, or how long it would stay on the ground. What makes this story stay with you? What makes it different from so many other railroad disasters of that era is how incredibly close McKee came to actually pulling it off. The tornado struck the train just behind the tender, at almost exactly the point where the locomotive was coupled to the baggage car. If McKee had managed another 5 or 6 seconds of speed, if the S2 had covered just a little more ground before the funnel crossed the tracks, the tornado might have passed harmlessly behind the last observation car, and nobody outside of Clay County would ever have heard about the Empire Builder's brush with disaster. His instinct to accelerate had been absolutely correct. Running was the right call when the alternative was sitting still and waiting to be hit. His execution had been nearly perfect. I'm pushing the locomotive to its limits while maintaining enough control to keep the train on the rails. The S2 had responded exactly as Baldwin had designed it to respond, delivering every ounce of power McKee demanded without hesitation. And still the tornado caught him, because a steam engine running at 60 miles per hour on a straight track simply cannot outrun a storm system that is crossing the landscape at unpredictable angles, appearing out of the murk with almost no warning and striking with a violence that no amount of horsepower can overcome. The Empire Builder returned to service within days of the tornado. Great Northern crews cleared the wreckage from the right-of-way, replaced the damaged cars with equipment from the railroad's reserves, and restored normal operations on the main line with remarkable efficiency. The track itself had sustained surprisingly little damage, a testament to the fact that the tornado had lifted the cars off the rails rather than dragging them along the ground. Within a week, passengers were once again traveling the route from Seattle to Chicago aboard the pride of the Great Northern Fleet, most of them completely unaware that a few miles east of Moorhead Station, a patch of prairie farmland had recently witnessed one of the most extraordinary collisions between human technology and natural force in American railroad history. Today, the Empire Builder still runs, operated by Amtrak on essentially the same route that the Great Northern pioneered nearly a century ago. Modern passengers traveling between Chicago and Seattle pass through Moorhead Station without knowing that somewhere to the east, all on a warm May afternoon in 1931, an engineer named B.E. McKee tried to outrace the sky itself. The S2 class locomotives are long gone, replaced first by diesel power and then by the standardized Amtrak equipment that covers most long-distance routes in the United States. But the story of what happened that day remains one of the most remarkable survival tales in the history of American railroading. McKee saw the tornado coming. He made a calculation that no operating manual could sanction. He bet everything on speed and horsepower and the desperate hope that a few extra seconds might be enough to save his passengers. And he came within inches of succeeding, close enough that the tornado struck the coupling just behind his tender instead of the middle of his train. Close enough that the locomotive emerged from the dust cloud still running, while everything behind it lay scattered across the prairie. He had seconds to decide. He chose to run. And 80 feet from the track, in a Minnesota wheat field that still gets farmed today, there is nothing left to mark, where a 70-ton Pullman car once came crashing down after being thrown through the air by a storm that no locomotive could ever hope to outrun.